I should say the Heavan Hill brand. You guys have such an eclectic, but yet at the same time, amazing products. How does Heavan Hill as a company do that?
Oh, well, first of all, I'll tell you, I'm Bernie Lubbers. I'm the global brand ambassador for Heavan Hill Distillery out of Louisville and Bardstown, Kentucky. And that's my teammate and compatriot, Jack Choate, and he is the ambassador for Heavan Hill Whiskeys out on the Western United States. And
hey,
so,
everyone.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And so the way it happened, Frank, it wasn't a big plan. It wasn't like they planned it out. And it's really cool to get these stories right from the horse's mouth. So I hear Max Shapira, and as I said, you know, we're family owned, family operated. Max is about 77 now. He is the second generation owner of Heavan Hill Distillery. And so you have Prohibition, which we were not in business for Prohibition. Nobody was. There's only 6 companies that got a license to sell medicinal whiskey for Prohibition. But our family owned department stores in Louisville, Kentucky. I mean, Louisville, called the Louisville stores. You all say Louisville, and that's the city that I live in, Louisville, Kentucky. But since I'm local, I say Louisville. And so they were called the Louisville stores, but they were in small little towns in Kentucky, kind of like the Walmart model, you know, like the big cities coming to you, okay? So the Louisville store and the People's store. So the interesting thing about Prohibition is there's people who were out of work for 14 years, and that's the distillers. And then there's people who weren't affected by Prohibition, and that's the people who had money at the end of Prohibition. So the distillers were out of money. They needed to go to try to find seed money to get into business. So members of the Beam family came to our family and asked them to invest in this new venture. And Jack and I, we always joke around because we always hear different amounts that the family invested in. Well, just to make it easy, we'll stick with what Jack and I have decided, $17,500. So they invest. That's a lot of money to me today. So I can't imagine 1935. That's a lot. That's a whole lot of money. And then so Harry and Joe Beam start making whiskey for us, and you know, and so the Beams, they're a very prolific distilling family. There's some people who generations of doctors or generations of lawyers or policemen or firemen. But you know, here in Kentucky and in the Beams, they had generations of distillers. There's more than, you know, there's dozens and dozens of distilleries, and you can only, you know, so there's the work available for if you have a large family. So Harry and Joe Beam are our first distillers. And so we make our the first barrel, December 13th, 1935, which was a Friday. And here in the United States, Friday the 13th is like supposedly a bad luck day. But for us, it was a good luck day. So we're still here 85 years later. So they make barrel syrup, but we wanted to go for bottled in bond whiskey because that's what was known, as my dad used to call it, the good stuff. So you wanted to, it's hard to reach all of the regulations that bottled in bond, and we can get into that later. But so that means it had to be aged for a minimum of 4 years. So we sold our first bottled in bond whiskey in 1939 then. So, and that's called Old Heavan Hill, is what that brand, and there it is right there. So that's Old Hill, and that was just this isn't a bottle from 1930 or 40 or whatever, but this shows you how we do not change things at Heavan Hill. This was just around until just a few years ago. Yeah. So that was our flagship brand. And then you had World War II breakout, 1941, and we got contracts to make high proof alcohol for the war effort. And I don't know the science and technology because I'm publicly educated in Kentucky. I don't know how that works, but you can make parachutes and other things from high proof alcohol. So we had just gotten our whiskey onto the shelf in 1939. 1941, we're off, right? And there's a 4-year gap. So after World War II, the family had bought the original, the original Beam faction had to sell off their portion of the company to the Shapiro family. So the Shapiro family is in total control until to this day. And they just had other investments and other things that just didn't go right. And they brought in Earl Beam from over at Jim Beam, Carl Beam's brother. He said, well, why don't you go, they're looking for a master distiller down there at Heavan Hill. Why don't you take our yeast strain here from Beam, go down there. And so after World War II, so we hadn't made whiskey for 4 years. That's kind of the new modern, you know, so that kind of puts an exclamation point on, so it's Earl Beam starts making whiskey after World War II. And then we knew that there was another conflict that was stirring up or in Korea. And the distillers decided, well, we're not going to be stuck, you know, without too much whiskey. We want to make so much whiskey before this because they're going to ask us to make whiskey for the war effort. And the government never came to them. Technology had changed. They didn't need them to make high proof alcohol, but they had ramped up production to such high levels. Now there's all this whiskey around. And after Prohibition was over, that's when your Johnny Walkers, your Dewars, your J&B, your Cuddy Sark, remember all these, you probably still have all these brands over there now, Famous Grouse, they had never had Prohibition. So we had to wait 4 years to get our product on the shelf for Bottle and Bond, and they had a 4-year head start on us. Then they had, you know, everything in place. So World War II didn't bother them as much, and especially for our markets. And then we had another thing that happened in the United States in the 1960s, and that was vodka and tequila come into the United States. So imagine never having to deal with those. And then of course, Canadian whiskey was flowing into the country during, right after Prohibition too, because they didn't have a Prohibition. So it made us slash all our prices and made our whiskey look cheap and not as desirable. And as Max Shapiro says, it almost sent us to the great liquor store in the sky.
Wow.
So this is the, here comes finally the answer to your questions. But I had to give you that background so you would understand what's going on. Now, keep in mind, okay, there's the big four. So we call them the big four. So it's the big four companies that were controlled almost all of American whiskey. And then so that was Seagram's out of Canada. So that's VO, Canadian whiskey. And they also made Seagram's 5 American blend and Seagram's 7 out of Lawrenceburg, Indiana. That's, some of you all might recognize that city. A lot of rye comes from out of there. So that was one of the largest distilleries in the world at the time. And so Seagram's, and then you have Hiram Walker, who had Canadian Club, and a Monster, so it's one of the big four. And then you had Shenley, which had brands like Old Stag and tons of stuff. And then you had National Distillers, which was Old Grandad, and at the time the #1 selling bourbon in the world, which was Old Crow at the time. So those were the big four. So when vodka and tequila come in, and then we have all this too much whiskey left over. And the interesting thing, and this is something that when Jack will probably tell you too, of what's interesting when you buy brands is you get inventory. You get all the barrels that come to feed that brand. So if you have the wherewithal and you're big enough and financially stable enough, what a great opportunity to build your distillery by acquiring brands from other distilleries. And you get all that inventory. You don't have to make that whiskey for several years, right? You get all the inventory for all the years. So because Heavan Hill was a different situation, because we still owned the department stores, so Heavan Hill Distillery was kind of in the United States, when you have a second little job or a part-time job on the side, we call that a side hustle. Okay? So this was just a side hustle for the Shapiros, really. But they were financially stable enough, and they started acquiring brands, you know, as well. So they didn't get the top, you know, they didn't get, you know, the you know, the big powerful brands and that kind of stuff, but they bought brands. And so that's when we acquired brands like Pikesville Rye out of Maryland. That's when we acquired brands like Rittenhouse Rye, JTS Brown, JW Dant, TW Samuels, Mellow Corn Whiskey, Georgia Moon. Okay? So we acquire all these brands, and what a genius way. You get all the inventory, so we don't have to ramp up production. See, if you want to make more whiskey on your still, you've got to put in fermenters, you got to put in another still, and that's millions of dollars of investment. But if you buy these brands, you have a few years before you have to make your mind up of what you got to do. And you have kind of guaranteed sales. You know, JW Dant is going to sell, you know, 100,000 cases every year, you know, unless you screw it up. So that's why to this day, we have such a wide and varied portfolio, is because of those acquisitions, and where companies like Beam Suntory and Diageo and Brown-Forman, they have to pick one or two brands and really hammer it home, like Johnny Walker and Bullet and Jim Beam, right? And Jack Daniels. And they've got to push because they've got stockholders, or they've got a lot of pressure on them to make money. So they have to make those 1 million case brands, and then 2 million case brands, and 5 million case brands, and 20 million case brands, or else they're in trouble. Their stock price goes down, whatever. Well, we're not, we're family owned. So Max says, well, shoot, I think last time I looked, I think Jack, if you know something different, I think Mellow Corn's about a 5,000 case brand for the whole, you know, for the whole world, right? So he's happy with that. That's 5,000 cases, right? And we got another hit out of the barrel. So it's kind of like found money to Max. He's like, you know, we're here to sell every barrel. So we certainly have 3 whiskeys that are our main focus. You got to have, we are in the bourbon business, not the bourbon charity. So you got to run it like a business, right? So we have Evan Williams, Elijah Craig, and Larceny are our 3 brands that we look at whiskey-wise to push. And then we have Evan Williams Bottle and Bond and Rittenhouse Rye that are kind of a little focus. And then we have, so I call it the engine that pulls the train, Evan Williams. That's our Jack Daniels, that's our Jim Beam, that's our Bullet, right? It's the engine that pulls the train. If the engine stops, the train stops, right? So the Heavan Hill train is pulled by Evan Williams, and in the, as we call it, the coal car, which has the fuel for the engine, we have Elijah Craig and Larceny, and then we have the train, right? So that's barrel proof Elijah Craig, that's Parker's, right? That's Pikesville, that's JW Dant, JTS Brown, Bernheim Wheat Whiskey, Mellow Corn. So that's the train, you know? And so when you look at it that way, it makes it easier for me anyway, and hopefully for Jack, he can tell you his own story. But that's kind of Heavan Hill in a nutshell, and how we have such a diverse portfolio, why we make 5 different styles of American whiskey, and everybody just makes, you know, 1 of something or 2 of something. We want to sell everything, and we're ready. What if we always joke to ourselves, what if corn whiskey is the next rye whiskey? We're ready. We got Mellow Corn, right? So that's kind of the story. Jack, do you got anything you want to add to whatever I left out? It was such a long-winded answer. I doubt I left anything out.
No, I mean, I think you covered it all. I was definitely ticking off the boxes on everything to make sure you didn't miss anything. And I think the one thing that I would add. Oh, there you go. I'm sitting in the wrong place. I'm about as far away from my bar as I can be in the house that I'm in. I think the one thing that I would add to that, just sort of reiterate what Bernie was just saying, it's like, any of the numbers that we throw out, the brands that we throw out, I don't think none of that was necessarily foresight, right? It wasn't like, all right, 1935, where are we going to be in 84.75 years, right? It just sort of happened that we did things in our opinion, the right way. I think that, as Bernie talked about, the 5 Shapiro brothers who had the Louisville store and the People stores, they were taught by their dad to offer the best quality product at the best possible price. And that's still what Max and his children who are running the business still do today. And, by doing that over the course of the last 84 years, following what his dad and brothers did, these opportunities have presented themselves. And, you talk about, the old Fitzgerald brand and the Larceny brand, weeded bourbon just sort of fell into Parker and Craig Bean's lap at the turn of the century when we acquired those brands. They had never made it before, and they were like, shoot, all right, let's go. We got it. We'll figure it out.
Wow. See, you guys, the knowledge. I mean, I read and I see why Bernie is called the Whiskey Professor.